Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azawi. The war on Iraq has been accompanied by a remarkable growth of media freedom. However, although Iraqi journalists can cover critical issues, the country is also hell on earth for journalists. Several laws are now being drafted to regulate the media, prompting skeptical Iraqi journalists to wonder if their freedom is about to be curtailed. The recent history of journalism in Iraq has shown that whenever the activities of political party bosses and militia leaders were covered, Iraqi journalists invariably end up either dead or disappeared.
In an unprecedented show of solidarity, over 1,000 Iraqis took to the street in protest last Friday.
We would like to tell the government the time of dictatorship is over.
Tight security and roadblocks could not stop journalists from pouring into the old quarter of Baghdad to express their outrage at government attempts to censor the press. The spark was the now infamous $6 million al-Rafidian bank robbery last month, which left 8 security guards dead. One of the alleged perpetrators was a private bodyguard working for Vice President Adel Abdul Mahdi. A local journalist wrote a scathing editorial hinting at a political dimension to the heist. He sarcastically claimed that the robbers would use the stolen money to buy 800,000 blankets for poor voters in the upcoming January elections.
The security services will have to issue an order to all banks banning armed groups from conducting robberies unless they have written permission from a powerful political party.
This editorial forced the journalist Ahmed Abdul Hussain to go into hiding due to death threats. And President Talabani showed his distaste for criticism of government officials in the press.
Instead of congratulating Mr. Abdul Mahdi for his service to apprehend the thieves and return the money, some in the press tried to use it against him.
President Talabani said he hoped that the press would not do such things again.
Accusing those in high positions in government with unfair charges is an insult to Iraq and Iraqi values. So we hope that in the future we don't see such harmful accusations in the Iraqi press.
The Iraqi government continues to put pressure on journalists already challenged by operating in the most deadly war zone since World War II. The government is trying to introduce new laws and utilize old Saddam-era laws to muzzle freedom of the press through intimidation and lawsuits.
These days, if you lie, you live. But if you tell the truth, you die.
Yet despite the consequences, these journalists remain determined to keep telling the truth.
Now I'm delighted to welcome from Baghdad Jane Arraf, the Christian Science Monitor Iraq correspondent, and Saad al-Muttalibi, a political advisor at the Ministry of National Dialogue. And from London, we are joined by Iraqi journalist Firishta Rapper. Welcome to Inside Iraq. Jane Arraf, let me start with you. In light of the powerful bombs rocking Baghdad yesterday, killing scores of people, is it still relevant for us to discuss an issue like freedom of the press in Iraq?
That's a great question, and certainly as journalists, I think we definitely have an interest in discussing this. But for the rest, I think what that attack does, that horrifying attack, which really shook so much that we thought was at the heart of the improving security here, it shows what the stakes are, that these are life and death stakes, and that journalists are part of that, and that's the atmosphere they're not only trying to cover, but the events they're trying to convey and the threat that the government feels in responding to journalists.
And yet, Saad al-Muttalibi, in the package we just seen, we saw Jalal Talabani, the Iraqi president, in a way sniping at the Iraqi journalists and Iraqi media for somehow covering the Rafidian robbery, and there were enough circumstantial evidence to implicate the Iraqi Vice President Adel Abdul Mahdi. Why is Jalal Talabani being so super sensitive?
Well, to start with, we're on the process of building a state. And that requires legislations and requires that even at the darkest moments to look at the press, the freedom of the press, and to look at the other aspects of the state of Iraq. I'm not here to defend anybody. I'm just saying that there were no evidence for somebody to write a piece, an article in a state-owned newspaper and claim that he knew in advance that anybody has the intention of doing the robbery and buying blankets and distributing the blankets through during the elections. That sounds to me like going out of the norm. This is not media reporting. This is accusation, and without any evidence. I mean, the journalist didn't have any evidence for his case. The journalist's job is to to convey the news and events that happen in the country as truthfully and honestly as possible, but not to make their own interpretation of events. Thank you.
Farishta Rapper, of course, that journalist is in hiding right now, fearing for his life. The article he wrote pretty much is a tongue-in-cheek, a political satire, if you will, rather than a direct accusation. But let me talk to you about yourself. You are one of the Iraqi journalists, if I am not mistaken, whose name is on a list. Tell us about it.
Last year, exactly just July, just over a year ago, the paper has leaked from the KRG official office that 14 journalists are the most wanted and has to be taken care of. And we even, again, we made sure that this is a genuine statement. I personally sent a letter, email to Nachir Barzani, personally sent it to Iraqi embassy. We sent a letter to every one of them to make sure, is this genuine or is this a joke? Because if this is a joke, it's a sick joke to threaten people with killing. They have been doing it for many years, and Jalal Talabani has to condemn that state because he had a lot for himself to cover up, a lot of dirty secret, what they're doing against the journalists. The only thing I have done in the past 4 or 5 years, I am writing morals, criticizing the abuse of power, the corruption, and there are billions of evidence over there, how they misuse the power and how they are abusing people and abusing the system in a daily light. So I'm one of those one could become a victim, and at the time, I was a lucky one. The person in Baghdad, I feel sorry for.
Indeed, you are remarkably lucky in the sense that you live in London and you contribute to the news and you appear on the media. But Jane Arraf, not everybody is as lucky as Farishta. Iraq has been, for the past few years, perhaps the most dangerous place on earth. More Iraqis, as well as foreigner journalists, have been killed in Iraq than any other war zone. And you have covered many of these war zones.
Absolutely. I think they're some of the bravest people on earth. And one of the amazing things about this past 6 years has been that throughout the tragedy, Iraqi journalists really keep coming out and trying to tell the news. Now, they are working in a very difficult background. This is a new industry. Press freedom here isn't developed, as we're talking about. There also aren't a lot of entrenched standards for the press. But one of the things that you see over and over is just an absolute proliferation of journalists who, despite the fact that almost 200 journalists and media workers have been killed here, still feel that they are going to go out on those streets, stand up to those officials, and it's absolutely amazing.
And yet, Saad al-Muttalibi, this proliferation Jane Arraf is talking about, you cannot help but seeing the tinge of sectarianism in it. Most of the newspapers and most of the TV stations and the radios, somehow, one way or another, they are affiliated by or financed by this political party and that political party, and they take a life of their own. They pretty much attack the others based on sectarian, on ethnicity, and other calibrations.
Absolutely right. Hence, we require regulations. We require laws to define rights and define limitations. This journalist jobs in Iraq is probably the hardest job to do.
What will laws do if you have militias assigned to a political party? They do the actual killing on behalf of that political party if their politicians are attacked.
I must interrupt you here. There are no militias anymore. The militias were crushed in a very bloody way last year, and we have now remnants of gangs that could be linked to this person.
Hold that thought for a second, because I see
that's an extraordinary statement.
Jane wants to say something. Go ahead, Jane.
I was just going to say that would really be wonderful if that were the case, but that's not the evidence that we are seeing, that we're hearing from Iraqis when we go out in the street. I think the consensus is that there are militias. There certainly are not the militias there were a year ago. That is certainly true. But there are places where militias are creeping back, and a lot of it depends on how you define militias.
Yes, you're absolutely right. As I said, there are still criminals, elements and gangs still roaming certain parts of Iraq, including Al-Qaeda, including from this party or that party. That is all possible. No. I'm sure Farishta could tell us more about the things in Kurdistan. But the case is that regulation is required. We do require to make sure that we safeguard the journalist. As I said, journalist's job in Iraq is very, very tough. So is the soldiers. So is every individual living in Iraq now. I mean, people who died yesterday in the explosion, they weren't journalists, they weren't soldiers, they were just passers-by. So things here in Baghdad are very dangerous, and journalists know that. But journalists also need to know the limitation of journalism. They need to know that they cannot accuse any citizen in Iraq.
Indeed they should, Saddam al-muttalibi, but when it comes to the ultimate sacrifice, hold on, by somebody going after them and killing them, that is not the way to settle the political atmosphere, Farishta, is it?
Of course, I'm not defending.
Let's listen to Farishta, please.
I'm saying that
Saddam al-muttalibi, hold on just a second.
Sorry, it's caused more violation. I totally agree with Jane. It's what sort of militia we're talking about. It is different, but the militia of today in the street, especially if I look at the north part of Iraq, is almost an enormous number of youth, unemployed and skillful. They are deprived from job, deprived from basic right, and they are angry, they are upset. These are the people contributing the violence because they have been ignored, and they don't feel they are part of they are not brutal murderers, they are not bad people, but they can't get a basic right like the son and the daughter of people. They are in power, they have got all the privilege in the world, and there are no equality. There is no equal opportunity between the normal people and the people's children's in power. That is what causes all these violations. People are very, very angry, and the government officials mainly, they don't listen to poor people, the people outside their zone and outside their border, and that is caused that violence. I'm 100% sure yesterday's bombing is caused from, it's not Al-Qaeda, it's not anything, but the anger of people that they are crying and screaming for some sort of security or basic life or improving that poverty around. You go to Baghdad, you look like a Stone Age village. It's just some area of Baghdad. You just feel disgusted with the country of an ocean of oil, and they live in such a poverty.
Jane Araf, let me get back to you regarding those over 200 Iraqi journalists who have been killed. Certainly they were not killed by all of them by Al-Qaeda, perhaps some, but not all of them. And yet Saad al-Muttalibi says what we need is laws, what we need is the regulations. We have regulations and we have laws regarding anti-corruption. We have laws regarding disbanding the militias. We have laws for pretty much everything under the sun. And yet the deterioration goes on. Is the answer lies really in another one law? Because right now the Ministry of Culture is drafting a law. Will that somehow put an end to the killing?
I can't imagine that laws ever put an end to killings. I think the intent of some of those laws, which is to prevent actions that would incite violence, are certainly admirable and perhaps even necessary. The problem with the law in a country like this, in a place like this, in a society that's really still developing, and a country that's really still deciding what it wants to be, is that the laws are going to be imposed quite harshly at the expense of transparency and at the expense of freedom. I would argue that instead of more laws, there should be more training. There should be more of a standard set for journalists. Certainly not licensing and certainly not official standards of journalists, but an attempt made to actually impose journalistic standards. And we all know what they are. They are making sure that you have more than one source. They're making sure to the best of your ability that what you're reporting is true, and not taking money from people. And that's something that's very, very hard to change, but that is something that does have to change.
Jane is just echoing what the Prime Minister al-Maliki said a while back, and that is total abhorrence about this Iraqi media, which has turned into really stoking the fire of sectarianism, and he has several lawsuits against several newspapers.
Can I just say I do not intend to echo Prime Minister Maliki in any way, shape, or form. That was not my intent. We may agree on a minor issue.
You echoed the right. You see, you echoed something that was right. You're not echoing the Prime Minister. Something right when it's said, it needs to be repeated. I must agree. I must say I agree with most what Jane said. And in the West, we have self-regulation for media. In Iraq, there is no self-regulation. There is no training. There is very limited amount of experience with journalists. Journalists write whatever they wish or like and print a newspaper and people read. We need the professionalism to be included. When I say law, I mean this part of the regulation that makes sure that a journalist has already been trained and understand the limitations or understand the criteria of being a good journalist, as Jane just said. At the same time, the efforts of securing society in Iraq is going on. And I must say the events of yesterday, it was clearly a demonstration of state-sponsored terrorism. No small group, as Farishta said, that they were responsible. What happened yesterday in Baghdad was a coordinated, tremendous amount of effort, logistics, and funding has gone into it. This is definitely a state-sponsored terrorism.
The killings of Iraqi journalists, Farishta, is not limited to Baghdad or in Basra. It also extends all the way to the north. Many Kurdish journalists have been killed, and many of them have been threatened, as you have mentioned at the top of the show. Yeah. To what extent the KRG government is doing something about it? Are they the help or are they the culprit?
Definitely they are the help. And just one thing KRG is being for over, since even after Saddam fall, I am heavily involved with the media. And one thing I am 100% sure that they do not believe for 1 second in a free speech and in democracy, and they do not. For so far, I am aware of hundreds of journalists is beaten, kidnapped, or threatened to death, and 2 of them was killed in our list.
Is this with the knowledge and consent of the KRG or without?
The one in Kirkuk recently killed Soran Mamahama. One of the Kurdish website, Kurdistan Post, published the name of the people killed Soran Mamahama in Kirkuk. The name is published. There is no condemnation from KRG. There is no response from KRG. But the people are from PUK and KDP, from the 2 political parties. They went to his house and killed him in a daily light. So at the moment, it's been a year. There is absolutely no investigation. They don't hand over the people killed that journalist. And every single human being in Kurdistan knows who killed that journalist, who is behind him.
Jane Arraf,
well, definitely.
You know Iraq, and you've covered Iraq from '91 onwards, and you straddled both eras. You have extremely a good experience about the Saddam era as well as post 2003. It's quite difficult to make a comparison between state-run 4 or 5 newspapers that pretty much the line comes from the top leadership to this plethora of newspapers, TV stations, and radio. How do you compare the 2?
I think one of the things that strikes me and a lot of other journalists is that there are remnants of that system, not so much within the media, but in the way that officials respond to the media. And what I'm talking about is perhaps something that ranges from a total lack of transparency on the part of some ministries, some ministers, to the thought that information is a weapon and it really shouldn't be shared. I have immense respect for journalists and for journalists here, and particularly respect for the journalists who every day try to get the most basic information out of people who are, at the end of the day, elected officials in many cases. And it is in many ways, and I know this sounds like exaggeration, it does many times remind me of dealing with the Saddam era. Having said that, it obviously is a completely different landscape. One of the things I think has moved backwards, and one of the things I've noticed in terms of security worsening, is the lack of female journalists. In Parliament the other day, where I used to see dozens of women who were journalists, there were hardly any. And that is something I think that's been a sad effect of the last few years.
That is no surprise, Jane Arraf. Far be it for us to remind our viewers about the mutilation of a very important Iraqi journalist, Atwar Bahjat, and what happened to her, and the pictures of her actually beheading from the neck. it shudders everybody to get into this journalism. But Saad al-Muttalibi, since you are an advisor for the Iraqi national dialogue, and this national dialogue has started, we have not seen the fruition of it, to what extent the media can play a very positive role in this national dialogue if it is properly administered?
2 points. First, if Jane said what she just said now, in Saddam's time, she would have lost her license, probably jailed, and definitely deported. But she could say that in Baghdad, totally free, and nobody is going to ask a question about it. So we leave this aside.
Thank you, but I'm not Iraqi, so yes, that is true.
So nevertheless, Saddam Hussein killed many non-Iraqis. Yeah. No, well, no, believe me, I can say it if you want. I'll say it on your behalf, and I'm Iraqi. The point is, the journalists were at the beginning, in 2005, they were taking sides. There were journalists who actually instigating violence and actually moving into sectarian lines. Now we see a better understanding of journalists to these circumstances generally, and they have curbed many of the writers who were, I'm talking about the official writers and the official newspapers, or general newspapers, not into internet. They started to write more responsible, and I think they have a duty to their country to show any embezzlement of funds, to show any corruption, to disclose any wrongdoing by officials, to gain information from any source in Iraq, but at the same time be responsible and not make false accusation, because false accusation in the end ends up with this believing of journalism. So it's actually make journalists goes into either hiding or make them unbelievable.
Let me get a response from Farishta. Final thought before I come back to you, Jane, and then you can wrap up the show. Go ahead, Farishta.
One thing I just want the Iraqi official and government understand is exact definition of what do they think by media. Something is very important they should realize. Media is a very important agent in ensuring that a democracy is operationally effective, and it assists greatly in establishing a system of balance and check, and again, and guarantee that those people in power, the one in power, held accountable for the wrongdoing. At the moment, in the whole entire Iraq, which I have got a great experience in Kurdistan, this is a 100% leaking and is lacking in the system as well.
A final comment from Jane Arraf about what Saad said. Go ahead.
Thank you. There are two issues, and one is the ability to express disagreement, to voice discontent with the government without repercussions, which I agree certainly exists to a far more extent than it did before the war. But what I am talking about is the willingness and accessibility of officials to actually provide accurate information to journalists. Without that, there can't be a free press. There can't be any sort of open government, and that is one thing that does not exist, and that is something that as a journalist, as a working journalist who struggles every day to get information and sees my Iraqi journalists struggling, my Iraqi colleagues struggling as well, that is something that is lacking, and there is very much a Saddam Hussein era mindset on the part of many ministries in dealing with the journalists and with information. They don't throw them in jail, they just don't give them information.
Jane Arraf, Saad al-Muttalibi, Farishta Rapper, thank you for being guests on Inside Iraq. To watch the show online and to find more information about the program, please go to aljazeera.net/English. We have reached the end of this show. Join me next week when we take another look inside Iraq. Until we meet again, have a great week.